Sé que a veces parezco demasiado apasionado. Sé que a muchos de ustedes no les gusta eso. Pero esta elección no se trata de mí, se trata de vos. Esta elección se trata de si queremos seguir por este rumbo que hace décadas nos conduce al fracaso o si queremos hacer algo distinto. Punto y aparte.
Javier Gerardo Milei has become the political phenomenon of the moment, and not only in Argentina. His victory in the PASO has catapulted him to an international level, and now there are many who want to take advantage of his victory in one way or another.
López Obrador evoked the ghosts of Hitler and Nazism when explaining Milei's triumph. Bolsonarismo celebrated Milei's victory in the PASO. It could be the real change that Argentina needs.
For the first time, a libertarian candidate has a serious possibility of winning the presidency of a country like Argentina. While Milei was an unknown and the phenomenon of his support may have been a simple manifestation of weariness, after the PASO, it has become a totally real option.
The Wall Street bank that anticipates a Milei win in the presidential election. According to Wells Fargo, the Libertarian candidate has a 65% chance of being elected president this year. Javier Milei anticipated that he was contacted by the IMF and that they will meet in the next few days.
Now, how did such a libertarian wave take shape in the land of the gaucho? Where does it come from, and what exactly are Milei's positions? What is his plan for Argentina? Well, VisualPolitik community, in this video we're going to answer all of these questions. So let's find out what's behind the Milei tsunami. Let's get cracking. Despite its ups and downs in economic matters, Argentine politics has, to a certain extent, more or less a constant thread. In the first part of the 20th century, with the consolidation of democracy, the Radical Civic Union emerged, the first major mass party which, in fact, won the first 3 open elections, those of 1916, 1922, and 1928. Then, of course, the armed forces got fully involved in life with the 1930 coup d'etat. From that moment on, Argentine democracy was, let's just say, intermittent at best. Coup d'etats followed one after another, and for years, democracy was limited to certain periods of time. In one of those spaces, Juan Domingo Perón emerged, who founded the Peronist movement, and he laid what would become the foundations of Argentine democracy from then on. On the one hand, anti-Peronism, usually linked to the Radical Civic Union and their allies, and on the other hand, Peronism, supported by the Justicialist party. So there we have it. This is the tandem that has completely dominated Argentine politics since the return of democracy in 1983. In the last decade, this duo has been represented under its various names by the opposition coalition, Together for Change, and for the ruling Peronist coalition, Union for the Homeland. And so it was until a third force saw a gap and suddenly entered the politics of a country with a devastated economy. Of course, we are talking about La Libertad Avanza, Liberty Advances, Javier Milei's political party. In the PASO of 2023, the Libertarians not only achieved an unprecedented national victory, but also obtained an enormous amount of votes in the interior of the country, in provinces and municipalities that were authentic Peronist strongholds. In fact, in both the federal capital and in the province of Buenos Aires, Together for Change and Union for the Homeland were able to retain their votes. So that means Javier Milei achieved his national triumph thanks to victories in places where no detractor of Peronism has achieved such feat, at least not in the last 5 decades. But what exactly was the window of opportunity that Milei took advantage of? How on earth did he manage to generate such an electoral maelstrom, a guy who came to politics in 2019? These are the first 2 questions we have to answer before seeing exactly what Milei wants to do with Argentina. So let's get into it.
The seed, disenchantment with Macri.
Corralito and the collapse of 2001 gave way to a country where the exchange rate, the latest inflation figures, and salaries are the focus of excessive social attention. Perhaps that is why, although it might seem strange to you in the land of eternal crises, economics is the #1 degree in Argentine universities. Every year, almost 15,000 economists graduate in Argentina. The constant crisis has made economic issues in Argentina a huge and growing political and social preoccupation. The economy is the real rock star of the political debate. In Argentina, at Christmas dinner, inflation is a popular topic. And guess what? Thanks to all this media maelstrom, one fine day, an economist who would gradually stand out from the crowd found space in the media. We are talking, of course, about Javier Milei. This is from 25th of August, 2015. Check it out.
La alternativa, digamos, en la que he estado trabajando es en la de colocar un bono, ¿sí?, en dólares, que vos lo suscribís en pesos, ¿sí? Y eso va a permitir eliminar el sobrante de dinero.
Gradually, and thanks to the 2015 campaign, the new libertarian icon began to have more and more presence in the media. At that time, Milei's interventions had a more technical profile. His criticism of the price interventions carried out by the government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner stood out above all. Be that as it may, the fact is that in those elections, Peronism lost. Mercurio Macri became the new president of Argentina on the 10th of December of that same year. Hopes for a great change were more than palpable. Expectations were sky high. Probably too high.
Porque yo hoy estoy acá porque creo en ustedes y necesito que ustedes también crean. Crean que son capaces de más, que pueden hacer más y merecen vivir mejor. Un beso enorme, enorme para todos. Los amo, amo este país y los amo cada uno de ustedes.
Macri's government had to deal with a lot of problems. In 2016, the debate, the great debate, was whether the new government should apply a shock policy or bet on gradual programs that would introduce changes little by little. In the end, the second possibility won. The attempt to seek a certain stability during the reforms and a higher level of consensus and social peace made government moves so gradual that in the end, most of the changes were barely perceptible. Due to this, very soon, Macrismo failed to meet all the expectations that were placed on this new era. In the end, neither public spending was reduced by that much, nor was the deficit being eliminated, nor was a great liberalization of the economy being approved. Everything remained more or less the same.
Fiscal deficit. The target is met, but still delays growth. The government maintains its strategy of gradual reduction of the budget in the red, which it finances with debt, but also determines the recovery of activity in 2017.
It was then when Milei positioned himself as a model for those who agreed with the first path. Go fast and go deep. It was here when the most heated version of this candidate was born. The formula that would lead him to become the third pathway for Argentine politics.
Milei warned that gradual adjustment plans end in crisis.
De hecho, desde mi punto de vista, este gobierno es el socialismo amarillo. No, yo no creo que sean corruptos, pero sí son colectivistas. Sí les gusta el gasto público. Sí, digamos, o sea, le gusta la intervención del Estado.
In the end, Macri's government was a disaster. With inflation skyrocketing and a very bad economic situation, he had to end up asking, once again, for a bailout from the IMF. Not surprisingly, in the following elections, Peronism returned, and it did it, what's more, through the front door. They did not even need to reach the second round of voting. In those 2019 elections, there was a pro-market alternative, that of José Luis Esper. He barely obtained 1.47% of the votes, but that meant the clearing of a path that would remain open. In the following legislative elections, Esper and Milei led a joint alternative that received almost 1.3 million votes.
Los únicos que estamos proponiendo un cambio de sistema para que Argentina no sea en el futuro la villa miseria más grande del mundo somos nosotros.
This was the great political debut of Milei, who ended up being deputy for the federal capital with 17% of the votes. In total, at the national level, the Libertarian platform won 4 deputies. That was the beginning. From then on, Milei's prominence took off exponentially. With Peronism back in government, his tough message began to catch on more and more. Milei suddenly became one of the main opposition figures. And of course, with such a disastrous government and on top of that, with the pandemic arriving right in the middle of everything, Peronism began to unravel. At times, everything seemed to be a real disaster.
Argentina's vaccine scandal. Health minister resigns after revelations of irregular vaccination of officials and other VIPs. Argentina remains the worst country to spend the pandemic in, according to Bloomberg ranking. Argentine education at its worst. At the end of last year, Laxo researcher Agustin Klaus warned about a projection showing that almost 1.5 million children dropped out of school after the quarantine.
And then came the inflation rates of 40, 50, 80, and even 100%. Also, the total lack of reserves and all of the crises the country was going through, which is something we have already talked about here on VisualPolitik in the video on the end of Peronism that was released just a few days ago. Argentina was beginning to want a change, and there was now more options. There was no reason to be limited to gradualism. Many people were fed up and wanted a firm, clear, decisive leader. That was the best breeding ground for Milei's libertarian narrative to take root.
Yo no me metí acá para estar guiando corderos. Yo me metí acá para despertar leones. Quiero escucharlos rugir. ¡Viva la libertad!
And that is exactly what happened. Milei began to work on his presidential candidacy in 2022, and barely a year later, the result was delivered.
Hoy nos hemos puesto de pie para decirle basta al modelo de la decadencia. Hoy dimos el primer paso para la reconstrucción de la Argentina. Invito a los argentinos a sumarse a la revolución liberal que va a hacer que en 35 años Argentina vuelva a ser una potencia mundial. Muchas gracias y ¡viva la libertad, carajo! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
Now, of course, the big challenge is the elections. And here, unlike Together for Change, the Libertad Avanza project is much more cohesive. Everything revolves around Milei, a candidate who can now claim the useful vote against Peronism. Milei's numbers say that he is in a position to win, especially if he achieves a second round against Peronist candidate Sergio Massa, which does not seem a far-fetched scenario. It's taken for granted, unless there is an economic debacle in the next months, that a significant number of the votes that were going to go to Larreta in the primaries may not go to Bullrich, but to the Peronist candidate. Larreta was Bullrich's opponent to run for president representing Together for Change. The key is that Bullrich has more conservative and pro-market positions than Larreta, who is more inclined to established understandings with the Peronists. If that is so, Bullrich would need to mobilize a large part of the vote that has not participated in the primaries for herself. It does not seem a particularly easy challenge. And that's what explains why Wells Fargo gives Milei a 65% chance of being president. On the other hand, if Bullrich manages to overcome Massa and to go to the second round against Milei, then the fight would probably be much closer. In any case, everything indicates that Peronism will have a very hard time indeed. All this, of course, is if Milei does not have any more setbacks like this one regarding the sale of organs.
Vos no permitís esto, es que la cantidad de órganos que va a haber disponible para salvar gente es menor. No. Sí, es menor. ¿Y por qué? Dios, o sea, los que ya estaban. O sea, lo que vos podés hacer es que ahora algunas personas quieren ingresar. Si yo, digamos, o sea, a ver, es una decisión mía. O sea, ¿cómo no voy a poder decidir sobre mi cuerpo?
Peronism is going to try to relaunch its options on the fear vote. Isn't this giving them a lifeline? Be that as it may, if there is one thing that is clear, it is that today Milei is very likely to end up being the president of Argentina. The question, logically, is what are his plans? What is the basis of the revolution he wants to carry out to turn Argentina back into a rich and prosperous country? Well, first of all, he promises to carry out a major reform of the state. He has committed himself to reducing public spending by 15% immediately, to reduce the number of ministries from 18 to 8, to progressively put an end to social payments, to replace public works with concessions, and to privatize many of the companies still owned by the state. We are talking, for example, about Aerolíneas Argentinas, or the oil company YPF. That is what libertarians have called the Chainsaw Plan.
Ministerio de Turismo y Deporte, afuera. Ministerio de Cultura, afuera. Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, afuera. Ministerio de las Mujeres y Género y Diversidad, afuera. Ministerio de Obras Públicas, afuera. Aunque te resistas.
But that is not all. At the same time, Milei has also pledged to push for another major reform of education and also of the healthcare system. The Libertarian candidate's idea would be to guarantee universal access to these services, but changing the current system to one of insurance in the case of healthcare or vouchers in the case of education. In this way, Argentines would receive an entitlement that they could then exchange for the health insurance and educational centers of their choice. Such a model would generate competition and private players would be able to compete on equal terms. Over time, it is understood that receiving the education check or having the state cover the cost of health insurance would be limited according to income. And so, little by little, a system could be created to which everyone would have access, but which would have much more competition, much less cost for the public coffers, and a more efficient way of functioning, it is believed. Likewise, Milei has advocated free trade a million times, and that is exactly what he wants for the country, for it to reduce all possible barriers and unilaterally open up to global trade. And then there is, of course, what we can consider as his star proposal. According to Milei, the definitive plan to put an end to the eternal problem of inflation in Argentina. We are talking, naturally, about the dollarization of the country.
Nosotros proponemos un sistema de competencia de moneda a la luz de lo que eligió los argentinos a lo largo de la historia es el dólar. Por lo tanto, vamos a liquidar el Banco Central en dólares.
Along with this, Milei also promises to end many of the regulations that affect Argentine economic life. We are talking about labor regulations, price regulations, professional regulations, and also tax reductions. In other words, what Javier Milei basically wants is to transform the country's productive system from top to bottom. So the question we have to ask is, logically, is all of this really even possible? Let's find out.
Rule with a chainsaw?
VisualPolitik viewers, it stands to reason that in order to carry out all the reforms promised by Milei, he would not only need to win the presidential elections, he would also have to get the support of the parliament. The problem is that in Argentina, the renewal of the chambers is partial. In each election, half of the Chamber of Deputies and 1/3 of the Senate are renewed. This means that even if Milei's party obtains the same level of support in the first round as it did in the PASO, this libertarian grouping could not get much more than about 40 deputies and 8 senators. This, of course, would leave it far from being able to control a Congress composed of a total of 72 senators and 25 deputies. Yes, the sum of Liberty Advances and Together for Change would have a very clear majority, but Milei would have to negotiate, and he would have to do so not only with a single party, but with a legislative force that in Argentina is usually quite diverse. Even if the candidates run on the same platforms as Together for Change, there are usually many different currents. The question is, would Milei be able to negotiate and reach agreements with the opposition? Well, the truth is that he himself has doubts that such a process could come to fruition, especially with regard to major reforms. Mind you, he does claim to have a plan.
Pero ojo, porque en Ecuador, esto es importante para tener idea cuánto tiempo demanda. En Ecuador lo quisieron hacer obligatorio y que a los 3 meses todos cambiaran los billetes.
The Libertarian candidate has said that he would resort to popular referenda, and not only in the case of dollarization, but also for many other policies, including high voltage issues such as, for example, the legalization of abortion. This is something that raises certain concerns not only within the political environment, but there are also serious doubts about the legal framework for this action. And here the law, a law that could not be changed without the agreement of the opposition, seems quite clear.
The law calling for a binding popular consultation must be dealt with in a special session and be approved by the vote of the absolute majority of members present in each of the houses.
That is, President Milei could only call for non-binding referenda without prior legislative approval. Yes, he could submit a referendum, win it, and then put pressure on Congress, but let's be clear about one thing. This would generate lots and lots of tension, and not only that, it wouldn't be a particularly quick process either. As it stands, Milei is creating a lot of expectations, and a possible political blockage could either make him lose his political momentum, or, in order to try and keep the ship afloat, throw himself at the neck of the legislature. Who knows where that would end up? It would certainly not be a good thing, because there are two big risks that exist. Because the problem arises, and we have seen it in other Latin American countries, when a president creates many expectations and they does not have the support to carry out those promised changes. But let's make it clear that this does not mean that Milei could not get his way. For example, by reaching a major agreement with Together for Change, or intelligently using non-binding referendums to increase his legislative influence in 2 years. What we mean is that the risk that he might not succeed and that this might have consequences is definitely at the fore, especially when we are talking about a candidate who is not in favor of seeking many agreements.
¿Usted se sentaría con ella a hablar de una transición si le tocara ganar?
No.
¿Y con Alberto Fernández?
Tampoco.
Of course, there may be something or someone that we are losing sight of, a profile that has been acting behind the scenes lately, and that, in the not too distant future, may play a key role in this entire story. We are, of course, talking about Mauricio Macri himself.
It is obvious that I think we are going to go to a second round with this new, more pro-market, more rupturist and angry expression of the frustration that Argentina has been dragging for years. The candidate of Together for Change, who is in that position, will have to demonstrate that beyond the rupturist and change intentions that Milei has, we have the same, but with experience, and that should tilt the balance in our favor.
The former Argentine president not only had a premonition months ago about the libertarian wave, but has long been particularly close to Javier Milei himself, to such an extent that last year, the libertarian leader raised this possibility.
Macri podría tener un rol muy importante trabajando en conjunto con la Cancillería. Si ella, digamos, quisiera venir a nuestro espacio, digamos, sería bien recibida.
Ministra de
Digo, podría ser hasta jefe de gabinete.
Of course, elections and electoral combat typically create many fractures. In any case, Macri could be the key to seeking a joint reform agenda. But for now, if one thing is clear, it is that Milei proposes to reform Argentina from top to bottom, and that now, for the first time, he has a good chance of becoming the new president of Argentina. Risks and opportunities are on the table. And apart from that, you know the story, we don't really have a crystal ball. So for this point, the questions are over to you. What is your opinion of Javier Milei? What do you think of his political plan? Do you think he will really end up being the new president of Argentina? Leave us your thoughts in the comments below and let's start a respectful debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thanks very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.